This conference will now be recorded.
Well, hello and welcome everybody to our Nightlight Fall Speaker Series. This is the second of 3 weeks of talks that we're doing, and I'm really glad to have everybody here. The people will be streaming in over the first 10, 15 minutes or so. I want to tell you a little bit about the Fall Speaker Series and my program so you know who I am and what you're doing here. And then I'm going to introduce our speaker series in whole, and then I'll introduce our speaker for tonight. I'll also tell you how you can make a donation for tonight's talk. So a little bit of info first, and then we'll dive into Becca's talk tonight. All right. So the Nightlight Speaker Series is something that grows out of an online course that I teach in ancient astrology. So each zodiacal season of the year, I try to bring out 3 or 4 speakers, professional astrologers, to give talks on a range of different subjects, usually things that I'm really fascinated in or that I'm really curious about, or maybe something I really don't know about and would love to expose my students to topics that may not be my strong point or something like that. We have lots of great speakers come through this series every year. And I also like to think about it like a little mini astrology conference. Over the course of 3 weeks, you can take in 3 different speakers, hear on about a range of different topics, kind of, take your astrology studies a little bit further, open up your mind and heart a little bit. So this fall series began last week. We had a talk from astrologer Chris Brennan, who gave a talk on sect called The Difference Between Day and Night Charts. It was really interesting, a concept coming from Hellenistic astrology. Tonight, Becca Tarnas is with us giving a talk on the astrology of, now I have to ask you how I say, is it Tolkien or Tolkien?
I always say Tolkien.
Tolkien, okay. Because every time I say it, I'm never sure.
I mean, Tolkien is a German name originally, and so the emphasis is on the second letter, een, Tolkien.
Tolkien. I'm ready to nerd out. I just want to tell you that. I'm so stoked. Okay, anyway, next week, before I introduce Becca and we go into Tolkien land, Sean Nygaard will be here next week giving a talk on Jupiter and Sagittarius called Vision, Truth, Adventure, Hope. Sean is one of my favorite astrologers. I think he has the record for most appearances. So if this were SNL, he'd be like having hosted SNL the most number of times or whatever. He comes out often. We love his work. He's a fantastic archetypal astrologer. We're going to look at the entrance and meaning of Jupiter moving into Sagittarius. So that's coming up next Tuesday night. So don't miss that. That should be a really great way to prime ourselves up for the Jupiter change next month. So the purpose of this series is to offer, community education in astrology and to create friendships and community among astrologers. And that's, I think for me, this is also an act of seva or service. I don't take anything from these series. All the money that we raise goes directly to our speakers. And this is a way of just celebrating and honoring the work of my peers and my elders. And also for all of us, it's a way of supporting the astrologers that we really love. And for students of astrology, it's a really great kind of karma yoga where we're, it's good karma to support astrologers that teach us how to be better astrologers. So that's the purpose of this series. And I also am genuinely, like every speaker that comes out, I'm genuinely interested in the topics that they have to present on. So I'm always interested in new speakers and new topics as well that I may not know about. So if you ever have a suggestion, feel free to email me at nightlightastrology@gmail.com. All right, so here's how you can donate for tonight's talk. I'm going to take you to the donate page of my website. My website is being redone right now, should be done sometime in February, and it's going to look all spiffy. But for now, this is a little do-it-yourself Weebly website, which I've had since 2010. You can see nightlightastrology.com payments and donations link in the chat box right now. If you click on that, you'll go to this page that you're seeing on the screen in front of you. You'll see a make a donation and a donate tab. Click on the donate tab. The suggested donation for tonight is $15 to $25. If you can't afford to make that donation, just do the best you can. If you can't afford anything because you're really hurting right now, please just be here, enjoy it, pay it forward in some way, tell someone a little bit about what you learned, make their day a little bit brighter, or next time you come out to a speaker series talk and you have funds available, make a bigger donation, whatever you want. At any rate, this series is meant to try and make astrology education like accessible for people. We don't want people to be priced out, so that anyone can keep learning about astrology. The other thing that's really important is that if you have more than 15 or 25 that you can donate, please do, because you're helping kind of make up the ground from people who can't afford to pay tonight or can afford only very little. So we ask you to be generous if you can. 15 to 25 is the suggested range. So I will put this little link in the box throughout the night and just remind you. We will be going till usually, anywhere from hour and a half to 2.5 hours is normal. Becca will take us on an adventure, and whenever she's out of gas, we'll take, be done for the night. She can put questions in the chat box as we go along, by the way, that's just fine. Becca will try to answer them as she goes or as she feels is appropriate, and may ask for my help at times if need be. So all of that good stuff being said, let me go ahead and introduce you to Becca. I have known of Becca and her fantastic work and research in the realm of Middle Earth for a long time. I was first wowed by a lecture that I saw of her. I think it was in some kind of yurt or something, and it was a long time ago, and I was just like blown away by this amazing Tolkien talk that she was giving. And then, I got to know Becca at NORWAC, I think it was 2 years ago. And there's nothing better than chumming it up with someone who likes astrology, Carl Jung, James Hillman, J.R.R, Tolkien, like a sister. So I'm very happy for Becca to be here tonight. We're going to be learning about the astrology really of the mind behind Middle Earth. So Becca Tarnas, PhD, is a scholar, counseling astrologer, and editor of Archive, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology. Fantastic publication, check it out. She received her doctorate in philosophy and religion from the California Institute of Integral Studies with her dissertation titled The Back of Beyond, the Red Books of Carl Jung and J.R.R. Tolkien. Becca received her BA from Mount Holyoke College in Environmental Studies and Theater Arts and MA in Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness at California Institute of Integral Studies. Her research interests include depth psychology, literature, philosophy, and the ecological imagination. She's currently teaching as an adjunct professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is a beautiful place to go for an astrology conference if you ever go. I've been to a couple there, and I was just like, wow, just so beautiful. It's a beautiful place to teach. So when I think of you teaching out there, Becca, I'm definitely envious of the scenery and the vibe of good spirits and deep conversations and stuff like that. Her website is beccatarnas.com. I'll be putting that in the chat box as well. She's teaching courses on Middle Earth right now and Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. I think they have another Silmarillion. Is that how you say it, Becca?
Silmarillion, yeah.
Silmarillion. Mm-hmm. That's coming up in the spring?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we just decided that we're going to be offering that through Neuro Learning in the spring. So. Awesome.
And Neuro Learning is really cool too. That's Jeremy Johnson, right?
Yeah.
And, yeah. Jeremy I go back to hanging out at Reality Sandwich together, and so I love what they're doing, and it's just cool to see all the creative wires that connect. So, okay, well, Becca, so happy to have you here. We're stoked to go into the imagination of Middle Earth and astrology together.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a total delight to be back here and getting to speak about, what are really probably my two greatest scholarly passions, loves. Scholarly is too narrow a word even to describe. Oops. Okay, I'm just figuring out the technology on my side too. And I think the image is coming through, and hopefully so is my voice and face and everything.
Yep, you're good.
Perfect, thanks. So this talk, in some ways, I feel like I can't believe that I've been working in the field of astrology and diving deep into the world of J.R.R. Tolkien and Middle Earth for so long without bringing these two together in any kind of talk or public presentation. So this feels like such an amazing and exciting opportunity, because these are subjects that have meant so much to me for so many years. I encountered the work of J.R.R. Tolkien when I was 9 years old. My fourth grade teacher read The Hobbit out loud to us, and I had this experience, a story I've told a number of times, where I had this experience in hearing the names and the descriptions of the places of Middle Earth, where it just felt profoundly familiar. And I had this sense of, I've been here before. This place, Middle Earth, feels familiar to me. And then a few years later, when I read The Lord of the Rings, when I was 13 years old, it just became the story, the myth that was defining my life. And I came to astrology on my own, at least, quite a few years after that, in my early 20s, and any kind of deep practice. But as a second generation astrologer, I had already grown up kind of in the zeitgeist, or in the kind of gestalt of an astrological worldview. So I was being informed from multiple sides by this kind of mythic perspective, the astrological perspective, and then, of course, Tolkien's world of Middle Earth. So getting to bring them together just feels so exciting and enriching. And looking at Tolkien's birth chart and what the transits were, both the world transits and his personal transits over the course of his life and his creativity, just it illuminates so much of what was going on for him personally, and also in terms of his relationship to the creative imagination, what was seemingly coming through him. So this talk is going to be a bit of a blend of, it'll be biography, Tolkien's biography. There'll of course be astrological analysis, looking at his birth chart, looking at his transits, also looking at the world transits at various points as it's relevant. This in some ways will be some literary analysis, because we're going to be looking at how the astrological archetypes as they came through Tolkien are present in his stories. And then this is also going to be a bit of an artistic analysis too, because I want to share some of the great artwork that Tolkien did. A lot of it isn't as well known as his writings. You're seeing here this image that Tolkien drew for The Hobbit to illustrate it. That's the Hall of the Elven King, the gateway to it in Mirkwood. And Tolkien has this very specific style of artwork that you can see here, and I'll be showing some more artwork later on, that it's evocative, it's rich, it's really just these powerful images that were emerging in his own imagination, and he's doing his best to capture them in paint and in pencil, and of course eventually the written word. So we're going to be doing kind of a lot of different things together in this talk, and while it will be astrologically focused, I think because Tolkien's work has been such a deep passion of mine, I'll kind of bring in different parts of his stories and so on. So I'm going to be drawing on a wide range of Tolkien's stories too as I talk about this. And just to give a bit of background before we dive into his birth chart or anything else, Tolkien is best known as the author of The Lord of the Rings, which was published in the mid-1950s. And he was a linguist, a philologist. He taught at Oxford University for many, many years. He taught he taught language, he taught philology there. So he had a very deep understanding of many languages and the evolution of languages, and had a rare and keen ear for language. He spoke 19 different languages of this world, and then he went on to invent another 14 for his stories. And I mean, what level of creativity is burgeoning through someone who can not only learn 19 languages, but then can go on to invent another 14. And the languages he was drawn to as well, they were old languages. They were often dead languages or forgotten languages like Gothic, or Anglo-Saxon. And he was really interested in, more obscure languages, or the myths and poems that were recorded in those stories. And he liked trying to discover the words that had been forgotten in these old languages, trying to see how, with different sound shifts over time, languages had evolved, and he could try and figure out, they're called asterisk words that are no longer recorded in any piece of literature or poetry, but that perhaps were the roots of different words. So this man had a very complex mind for language, and then also for story, this extraordinary storyteller who wrote this massive book. I have one of my copies here right next to me. I mean, it's a tome, The Lord of the Rings. It's this huge book that when it was published in the mid-1950s, critics had no idea what genre it was meant to belong to. I mean, now we recognize it as a work of fantasy, high fantasy, but in its time, it didn't fit into the categories of the typical, 19th or 20th century novel. It's filled with these fantastical beings such as elves and dwarves and orcs and hobbits. And it's not a children's story, and it tells this long, winding narrative about a struggle between good and evil. And so when it came out in the mid-50s, many literary critics just had no idea what to make of it. And a lot of them were even quite dismissive of it. So, and yet this story has seemingly stood the tests of time, or at least several decades, and become really beloved to multiple generations now. And I love hearing stories about people's first experience of reading The Lord of the Rings, because sometimes they're reading it when they're young, sometimes it was someone significant reading it out loud to them, and it's been kind of passed on now between a few generations, and seems to be really in some ways carrying this quality of being a myth for our time, because it speaks to so many of the themes that are present in our current era, and yet it's carrying these timeless themes, and taps into an ancient quality and even a feeling almost of eternity. So Tolkien is best known as the author of The Lord of the Rings, but he wrote much more than that story. And a lot of that is what I'm going to be filling out in this presentation, is what led up to the writing of The Lord of the Rings. Because Tolkien actually started writing the first stories of Middle-earth, the first myths of this imaginal world, all the way back in 1914. That was the beginning. And he was writing all through those years of the 19-teens, the first stories of Middle-earth, and they're these elvish histories. And in some ways, he's inspired by different, what we would, now consider fantasy authors before him, George MacDonald, William Morris. He was inspired, of course, by Norse mythology, Finnish mythology, the Icelandic Eddas, Celtic legends. So he's hugely inspired by all of these mythic themes. But there's also something unique that's happening for Tolkien, that's happening for him in terms of his imagination. And that he started at a fairly young age, in his late teens and early 20s, to be writing these stories, basically with the desire to write. First, his wish was to write a mythology for England, a mythology that he could dedicate to his homeland, because he felt like, unlike Greece or Finland that had, or Iceland that had these myths that kind of constituted a sense of identity that was grounded in the landscape, grounded in the culture, grounded in the people, he felt that those stories had been lost for England. He felt that the Arthurian legends weren't sufficient, in part because they're not only tied to England, but also to France, and that the biggest thing for him was that they contained Christianity, and so they didn't count, in some sense, as a true myth in the way that Tolkien was hoping for. And so he set about, at least with the initial goal, to write a mythology for England. But the thing is, I don't think that's where he actually ended up. That's where he started in those early years of writing a creation myth and writing all these early elvish histories tied to the island of Britain. But these stories seem to have their own agency and directed his writing in some way as it wanted to. And so instead of this kind of elvish mythology for England, instead where we end up is with The Lord of the Rings, which is a story of Middle-earth, which, as Tolkien said, Middle-earth is our world, it is our Earth, but in an imaginary time. And so that story in many ways is encompassing more than his first intention of this being a mythology for England. So that's a little bit of a setup for who Tolkien is. And let's see, I'm just making sure that I can see all of my, there's the screen, perfect. So that's a bit of a setup of who Tolkien is and what it is he's contributed and where he was starting. So here's an image of him late in his life, smoking a pipe, as he was often wont to do. And I want to begin with Tolkien's natal chart. So Tolkien was born on January 3rd, 1892 in Bloemfontein, South Africa. It's interesting for someone so firmly English that he actually wasn't born there, although he traveled very little in his life, at least externally, although we could say he was very well traveled in terms of traveling through the lands of the imagination. So we definitely have his birth date. The time is uncertain. So this is a rectified chart, 10 p.m., and that's based on what evidence we have from about when his father said that he was born. So we'll just keep that in mind, that the time may not be accurate, but the day definitely is. And my approach in general is one of focusing more on the planets and the aspects and the archetypes associated with the planets. So this astrological analysis will really be mostly focused on that rather than on the signs or the houses. And a large reason for that is just that's my area of expertise, and what I feel most proficient to speak to, both in terms of my own study and research, but also where my intuition is, and how I understand the astrological archetypes as they're associated with the planets. So that's going to be my primary focus in this talk and in this analysis. So the place that I want to begin here is by looking at his Neptune-Pluto conjunction. And let's see. So that Neptune-Pluto conjunction, you can see there right at the top of the chart. And the Neptune-Pluto cycle is a 500-year cycle. And if we look back through history, each time Neptune and Pluto have come together in a conjunction, those cycles, those 500-year cycles, seem to correlate with the rise and fall of great civilizations. And so our most recent conjunction of these two planets was this one that happened at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And using a 15-degree orb for the world transit of Neptune conjunct Pluto, that transit lasted from 1880 until 1905. So it's a long transit, but it was within 1 degree from 1891 to 1893. So of course, Tolkien is born right in the middle of that, and you can see that this conjunction in his chart is very tight between Neptune and Pluto. And just to speak to the qualities associated with these two planets, Neptune is the archetype of the imagination, of enchantment, of magic, of the image, the wellspring of images. And it's connected to the transcendent, the spiritual, the numinous, and it's, symbolized by water, by merging, by permeating. And Neptune, in this conjunction with Pluto, Pluto is the archetype of the depths, of the underworld, of the elemental powers of nature, of the primal and the primordial. Pluto is connected to the death rebirth mystery, to the deep transformative process of dying and being reborn, like composting, or like the phoenix rising from the ashes. So it's this marriage in some ways of with Neptune and Pluto, of the heavenly and the hell realm, of deep transformation through the imagination, of the deep unconscious, of the archetypal and the symbolic coming or rising up from the depths, of the numinous spiritual vision that is also intimately tied to the demonic and the powerful and the corruptible. So it's this profound marriage between these two radically different transpersonal archetypes of Neptune and Pluto. And Tolkien is carrying the signature of this complex so profoundly. Just even in looking at the fact that the Neptune-Pluto 500-year cycle correlates with the rise and fall of civilizations, this is such a major theme in Tolkien's work. The Lord of the Rings takes place at the end of the Third Age. It's about the downfall, certainly of Sauron, of the Dark Lord, but also about the loss and downfall of many forms of life and civilization, the passing and ending of a world, of an age. And these are themes not only in The Lord of the Rings, but throughout what Tolkien has written. His earlier stories of the First and Second Age of Middle-earth, each of these ages comes crashing down in this powerful way, usually with the intervention of the gods. I mean, you see the Plutonic destruction and the intervention of the Neptunian divine, the gods, the sacred. that comes about, for example, in the drowning of Numenor, which is this kind of Atlantis story that runs all the way through Tolkien's stories, or the end of the First Age. It comes to a close when the gods intervene and overthrow the Dark Lord. So the scale, Pluto relates to that massive scale, and all of this is coming through the Neptunian imagination for Tolkien. And so many of the themes that Tolkien is writing about do have this Plutonic quality: the underworld, hell, the journey into hell, the journey to Mordor that happens in The Lord of the Rings, and all these other, the dragon, for example, as a symbol of the Plutonic, as we see in The Hobbit, as well as in the Silmarillion, or these battles against evil and the shadow. Again, all these Plutonic themes, but they're taking place through the imagination. They're taking place in an imaginal realm that Tolkien is writing about as fantasy. He's not approaching those themes in this kind of realist way. He's approaching them through the mythopoetic imagination. Tolkien spoke about the realm of fairy, which we could say is like the imaginal realm. He would write about it in some of his essays and his letters. And fairy we can think of as this very Neptunian place. Connected to the imagination. We travel there on the pathway of the imagination or through dreams. It's a realm of symbols, imaginal figures, all these very Neptunian things. But Tolkien called the fairy the perilous realm because it's dangerous. It's dangerous to go there. And he calls it the perilous realm that one must not ask too many questions while there, lest the gates be shut and the keys be lost. And what I think he meant by that was that the perilous realm is, in some way, it's the realm of the imagination, but it's also the realm of madness. And when the gates are shut and the keys are lost, that's when we fall into a psychosis or into insanity, when we don't find a way there and back again, to use his title, the subtitle from The Hobbit. Continuing with this theme of the Neptune-Pluto conjunction, I mentioned the downfall of Numenor. And Numenor is this island kingdom that flourished in the Second Age of Middle-earth. And I'm going to be telling, by the way, I'm going to be referring to The Lord of the Rings, and I'm just going to openly say that if this is a story you haven't read yet, I'm going to be giving spoilers, but I have a feeling probably most people who are drawn to Tolkien's work have either read this book or seen the films of The Lord of the Rings. So I am going to freely talk about all facets of plot. And I do want to say that if you've only seen the films of The Lord of the Rings and you haven't read this book, you are so lucky, because now you have the opportunity to someday get to read it and to have that experience for the first time, because there's nothing quite like your first time reading this story. So I am going to be speaking to many different elements within The Lord of the Rings itself, but also referring to other writings of Tolkien's. And some of you listening may be quite familiar with these, some perhaps not at all. And so I'm going to be, filling in those aspects of the story as best I can. But Tolkien really is presenting a vast myth. I mean, there's another Neptune-Pluto theme, this full mythology, and it's remarkable how many different story cycles are woven together in the mythology of Middle-earth. So this one that I'm referring to, the downfall of Numenor, is kind of like a telling of the Atlantis myth. But Tolkien wasn't telling this story because he was fascinated with the Atlantis myth, having read it, whether in Plato or any other telling. The reason he wrote about the downfall of Numenor was because starting at a young age, and it seems to be maybe around 7 years old, that he started having a recurring dream of what he called the Great Wave, the ineluctable wave. And I want to just read a brief quote from Tolkien describing this recurring dream of the Great Wave, what he called his Atlantis haunting. So this is Tolkien describing it in a letter. This legend or myth or dim memory of some ancient history has always troubled me. In sleep, I had the dreadful dream of the ineluctable wave, either coming out of the quiet sea or coming in towering over the green inlands. It still occurs occasionally, though now exorcised by writing about it. It always ends by surrender, and I wake gasping out of deep water. So we can hear just in this quote the Neptune-Pluto themes I've been talking about. It's the wave, it's the sea, it's the ocean, which is Neptunian, but it's a destructive wave, the ineluctable wave. And in Tolkien's stories of it, this great wave destroys a complete civilization. And he had the dream again and again, and so he kept writing this story. He kept trying to find a form for it, and he wrote it in these incomplete versions in a story that he started in the mid-30s called The Lost Road. He explored it a lot in another unfinished story called The Notion Club Papers that he was working on in the mid-40s, right in the middle of the time that he was writing The Lord of the Rings, actually. And he ends up including that story in The Lord of the Rings itself. And he gives it as a dream to Faramir, the brother of Boromir, one of the Fellowship. And Faramir himself also has this dream. And of course, he is a descendant of the people of Numenor. And so he has in some way inherited this traumatic memory of this dream. Faramir has. And so we can see here, and Tolkien said that the dream was now exorcised by writing about it. He was able finally to let this archetypal image that was moving through him finally be given to, perhaps we could say, the right character who was meant to dream it, Faramir. And then he finally was able to let it go. It finally stopped recurring for him. Now, what's really interesting about this is Tolkien's son, Michael, it's his second son out of 4 children. Michael inherited this dream from Tolkien, and it was unbeknownst to Tolkien that this was the case until many years after his own son had been having this recurring dream. And Tolkien himself suspected that he had inherited it from his father, although both his parents died when Tolkien was fairly young, so he didn't ever get to confirm that. But it opened up this idea for him of inherited memory, which is its own vast topic. So there's much more. We could probably spend the entire time focused on this Neptune-Pluto conjunction, but we'll leave it for now because I want to fill out the picture more in terms of Tolkien's chart. And you'll notice that there's actually a grand trine here. That Neptune-Pluto conjunction at the top is in a trine to Venus on one side and a trine to Saturn on the other. And there's a wide trine between Venus and Saturn as well, completing the grand trine. But I really think, even though they're 9 degrees apart, that Venus-Saturn trine, as I'll unpack in a minute, is definitely present in Tolkien's life and definitely operative in his chart. But first, just to look at the Venus trine, first to Neptune. When you bring, first of all, Venus relating to love, beauty, aesthetics, desire, attraction, to color, and artistry, artistic expression, poetic expression, Venus, Aphrodite ruling these themes. Having Venus in that trine, first to Neptune, we can think of the aesthetics of Middle-earth, the elves and elvish culture, how they have this exquisiteness, how they have this spirituality, this holiness, this numinosity, not only to the elves, but to so many of the qualities of Middle-earth. It has this kind of ethereal Art Nouveau quality, which is so characteristic of the Venus-Neptune combination, expressed in this trine as Tolkien is born with it. There's this profound emphasis on beauty, spiritual beauty even, numinous beauty. And then there's also the element of the love story that's present in several of Tolkien's tales, the fairy tale romance that we can see in The Lord of the Rings, even though it's not in the book explicitly on the surface, the romance between Aragorn and Arwen, mortal and immortal, man and elf, and their story is told in greater fullness in the one of the appendices to The Lord of the Rings. Is the tale of Arwen and Aragorn. And it has this Venus-Neptune quality of the fairy tale romance and this sense of destiny for each other, of being soulmates in some way. And their story, that love story between Aragorn and Arwen, echoes an earlier story that Tolkien wrote of Beren and Luthien. And it's kind of the central narrative of the Silmarillion. And Tolkien wrote the very first version of it in 1917. So long before he wrote The Lord of the Rings. But before I go into that story, what's there, and you could even think those themes of Venus Neptune being connected to, it has this connection to fairies, to elves, to the imagination, to kind of the legends of the human being taking the fairy wife or the elf bride, which is in Celtic mythology, for example. But before I go more into that story, which really was in some ways the central narrative of Tolkien's whole mythology of Middle-earth, this union between mortal and immortal, between elf woman and human man. I want to mention the role Saturn plays in this grand trine too, particularly that Venus-Saturn trine, because Venus-Saturn, Saturn has to do with negation, with blocks, with time, with slowing things down, with separation, with loss, with distance, and all of that's going to come through the realms of Venus, love, romance, and this is very much part of Tolkien's story. So this whole life story, his biography. So this whole grand trine, both the Venus-Saturn themes of separation, distance, and the Venus-Neptune themes of a sense of a fairy tale romance, and even the Venus-Pluto themes of being deeply transformed through love for another, show up in Tolkien's love and romance with his own wife, Edith Bratt. And Tolkien met Edith when, let's see, there she is. Tolkien met Edith when he was 16 years old, and she was 19. They were living at a boarding house, and Tolkien was an orphan. He was living there with his younger brother Hilary, and Edith Bratt also was essentially an orphan. Her mother had died when she was young. Her father had disowned her because she was illegitimate, born out of wedlock. And so Tolkien met this beautiful young woman and was absolutely enchanted with her. right? The enchanted love. You can hear the Venus Neptune there. And they were able to come together to share their sense of loneliness, loss, losing their parents at such young ages. And Tolkien just fell completely in love with her. But Tolkien was in kind of interesting situation because he was clearly very bright, very skilled with language, and his path was really going to be in scholarship and academia, and yet he had very little money, and he was under the guardianship of a Catholic priest, Father Francis Morgan, and Father Morgan was worried that the relationship with Edith would be a distraction and that Tolkien wouldn't study as hard as he needed to get a full scholarship, to attend Oxford as a student, to be able to fulfill a career in the academic world. And so eventually, after a few years of this romance between Edith and the young Ronald Tolkien, the Father Francis Morgan forbid their love. And so you can hear there the Venus-Saturn themes, the forbidden love. There's the Plutonic there as well because it's taboo. It has to be hidden, kept below the surface, secret. But really the separation of Saturn. And Tolkien was forbidden from meeting her or even having any kind of communication with her. And for 3 years, there was absolute silence between them. And this was an extremely difficult period in Tolkien's life, these 3 years where he couldn't speak to Edith at all. And so again, you can see the Venus-Saturn themes of the separation and the longing. But my sense is that, with his Venus-Neptune there too, in that time, in some way, he mythologized who she was. She became an anima figure, to use a Jungian term, and really became this figure of divine love, the ideal beloved in Tolkien's imagination. Now, the story does end beautifully in that on Tolkien's 21st birthday, so January 3rd, 1913, he was able to reconnect with Edith. He wrote her on the first day that he was allowed to, 21st birthday, this letter of reconnection and devotion, and it turned out she was engaged to somebody else. So again, the Venus-Saturn theme of the lost love, another barrier standing in the way. But Tolkien was determined this was the woman that he was destined to be with, and he traveled to where she was and convinced her, wooed her to marry him instead. And just a few days later, she broke off her previous engagement and chose to marry Tolkien instead. So this love, which on the one hand carries this idealized quality of the Venus-Neptune, it also, like any real world connection in marriage, had its troubles, its challenges, and you can see that reflected in the Venus-Saturn, the Venus-Pluto, over the course of their long life together. But I want to speak to that kind of overlay of Edith with Tolkien's, you could say, anima figure, because when Tolkien started writing the mythology of Middle-earth, he started writing this tale of Luthien, this immortal elf woman, and Beren, the mortal man that she falls in love with and who falls in love with her. And the core image from that, Beren sees Luthien dancing under starlight in a forest glade. And it's this beautiful image of watching her dance. And that image comes directly from something that Tolkien experienced with Edith. So Tolkien fought in the First World War, and he was on leave in 1917. And he and Edith were out together, and they were walking through this forest, and she danced for him. And the image stayed with him and became a part of this story. And Tolkien said of Edith, she was, and she knew she was, my Luthien. So she knew that she was this figure for him, and that in some ways, this exquisite, immortal elf woman had been conflated with her, and that love that he had for her was in some sense this exquisite, immortal love. You can see actually they were buried under the same tombstone in a graveyard a little outside of Oxford. I got to visit there a number of years ago. And on the tombstone is Edith's name, Edith Mary Tolkien, and it gives the years that she lived. And then it says Luthien. And then when Tolkien himself was buried under that same stone, it says John Ronald Royal Tolkien, and then the years he lived, 1892 to 1973, and below that it says Baron. So he knew that they were living out this mythology together. So while we're still focused on this grand trine, coming back to Tolkien's chart, I want to speak to particularly the Saturn-Pluto trine that's also there. Looking at that for a moment, apart from Neptune being there, apart from Venus. And Saturn-Pluto, it correlates with, in world history, with major periods of crisis, conflict, with splitting, othering. That's why when there are Saturn-Pluto alignments, we often see international conflict, for example, and it carries a weightiness, a heaviness. Really kind of profound moral themes are connected to the Saturn-Pluto alignment. And so Tolkien's born with the trine, but there's this diachronic patterning, so patterning through history of subsequent Saturn-Pluto alignments that have a significant role to play in relation to Tolkien's life and the unfolding of his story. So just to move ahead, I wanted to share some of these dates. First of all, the First World War happened, it began in 1914 under a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. And I'll show the chart for the First World War in a minute. Tolkien fought in that war, and it, as one would expect, had a huge effect on his life, and of course on his writing and on his imagination. He was part of a very close-knit group of friends. There were 4 of them, and 2 out of the 4 were killed in the Battle of the Somme. And it's hard to even speak to what the effect, the profound traumatic effect of this war would be on anyone who fought in it, but particularly since we're looking at Tolkien, the effect that it had on his writing. And these were the earliest years that Tolkien was writing about Middle-earth. And while these are such fantastical and imaginal stories, they have a gravitas to them and a weightiness, and that grappling with evil, with the darkness, with the underbelly of humanity in some sense, that came into his stories right at the time that he was in the war, particularly 1916, 1917, around the Battle of the Somme. So just to look at this diachronic patterning, there's the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that correlates with World War I beginning. There was a Saturn-Pluto square that was in the sky when World War II began. And Tolkien wrote, it took 12 years to write The Lord of the Rings. And those 12 years fully encompass the entirety of the Second World War. So that square lasted from March of 1939 to March of 1941. And that energy of the Saturn Pluto was most definitely in the air all through those years that Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings. Now, The Lord of the Rings was published in 1954 and 1955. It's published in 3 volumes, and there was a Saturn-Pluto square, interestingly, in the sky during those years that The Lord of the Rings was published. And then finally, the last piece is that the films that Peter Jackson directed were released from 2001 to 2003, and that correlated with the opposition of Saturn and Pluto from June of 2000 to April of 2004. So we see this interesting patterning between Saturn-Pluto alignments and world history, and the unfolding of Tolkien's writing and of the stories of Middle-earth, both what was called the Book of Lost Tales that he was writing in the 19-teens, which is the first stories of Middle-earth, then writing The Lord of the Rings itself, which encompassed the Saturn-Pluto square, and the subsequent Saturn-Pluto conjunction actually later in the 40s. That was exact in 1946. So there were 2 Saturn-Pluto alignments while Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings. Then it's published under Saturn-Pluto square, and then the films were released under the opposition. And if we think of the moral conflict with evil, the facing of the shadow, not only in the external world that's expressed in The Lord of the Rings, but within oneself. Think of a figure like Gollum, who is wrestling with his shadow in the Jungian sense, but that shadow has taken on its own embodied form, so to the point that he's split into 2 personalities. And that's one of the themes of Saturn Pluto, is this splitting, this othering, this splitting away and saying this is evil and I am not. And so much of the work related to Saturn Pluto psychologically is about how do we not split off within ourselves? How do we integrate the shadow within us? And I think that very much you can see the difference between Gollum, where that split has taken place, and Frodo, who continues to wrestle with that in himself, and he knows he is capable of becoming what Gollum is. Indeed, he becomes that. The ring can't be destroyed in the climax of The Lord of the Rings without Frodo becoming evil. That's what triggers what makes possible for the ring itself to be destroyed, in some ways because evil needs to eat itself, that it cannot simply be conquered by good. Evil must destroy itself. And so really it's this sacrifice on Frodo's part. It's his necessary failure that he has to give in to the temptation of the ring. He has to become evil in order for the ring to be destroyed. So again, Tolkien is born with the Saturn trine Pluto in his chart, and then we see this patterning through history. We just jump ahead briefly to glimpse these charts. You can see there the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that the First World War started with up there toward the top. And then actually, and there's also a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, you can see toward the bottom, when the First World War started as well, which was an interesting thing about the First World War. There was this enthusiasm, this feeling of expansiveness and joy even when the war started, or just as it was beginning. Maybe it had been just long enough that Europe hadn't been in a war that they had forgotten how awful war could be. And there was a lack of recognition of how much technology, machinery had changed, because the First World War was the first time there were tanks and machine guns, but the old battle tactics weren't working. That's why it was such an awful and devastating war. because there was this enthusiasm going into it. One of my teachers told me this story about how there were German young men and English young men that were meeting at universities as the war was starting, and jovially saying to each other, well, I'll see you on the battlefield. Like, there was no recognition of how awful this war was going to be and how fundamentally it changed the collective. Now, if we look forward to World War II, you can see there the tight Saturn-Pluto square. Saturn at 0 degrees Taurus and Pluto at 2 degrees Leo. So again, just seeing that correlation between the First and the Second World War and Saturn-Pluto. Okay, so that's some on Saturn-Pluto as it is in Tolkien's chart, and as it is in the world transits. I'm just seeing here a note from Greg saying that 1914, the Pluto-Saturn conjunctions, also Tolkien's own transiting Saturn square natal Saturn, along with transiting Pluto square natal Saturn. Yes, absolutely. And that is part of why this was such a pivotal period for Tolkien, because he's having these really challenging, what we would often see as challenging transits of that Saturn-Pluto crossing this part of Tolkien's chart, and crossing his Saturn and also his Mercury. So I'm first going to go into his natal Mercury-Saturn square. So coming back to the natal chart, you have an exact Mercury-Saturn square, Mercury at 0 degrees Capricorn, in Saturn's sign, square to Saturn at 0 degrees Libra. So exact square. This is, I think, the tightest aspect in Tolkien's chart. And Mercury relates to language, to thinking, the mind, the logos. If we think of Tolkien as the linguist that he is, and that connection to Saturn, well, he was drawn to ancient and even dead languages, Saturn having to do with what's old, with time, and even what is dead. He was a notoriously slow, even meticulous writer. He had so many unfinished projects. I mean, this is why it took him 12 years to write The Lord of the Rings. That is a long time to commit to a writing project. You see the Mercury Saturn there. It's also a long book. It's this long, heavy book. Again, Mercury Saturn. And then how many other things that he didn't finish. He so badly wanted the Silmarillion to be published as a companion book with The Lord of the Rings, a tome of the same size, and he spent his whole life working on that book, and he never finished. So again, that Saturnian theme of the long committed project that doesn't get completed, that death is the final ending to that project. And fortunately, Tolkien's son, Christopher, who's his literary executor, has brought forward so many, pretty much everything that Tolkien left unfinished. Even this year, The Fall of Gondolin, which is the very first story Tolkien wrote of Middle-earth in 1916, is now being brought out in 2018. Christopher Tolkien is now in his 90s. He's been doing this work for decades, and what karmic devotion to spend so many years of his life bringing forward his father's unfinished, unpublished works. But we can see that Mercury Saturn, the words are cut short. He's too careful. He's too meticulous. He is such a devoted editor that he often couldn't bring things into the form of perfection that he wanted to. And so there's this sense of he's holding himself back because of that, both that Saturnian desire for perfection, precision, but also that in itself is negating him and stopping him. Whenever he went in to revise something, he would end up rewriting it again from the beginning. How many times he rewrote The Lord of the Rings right from the beginning is just shocking. Getting just the right words. That's what Mercury Saturn does. So meticulous. A couple other things on this aspect in Tolkien's chart. He was a boring and quiet lecturer. So he taught at Oxford, and his lectures he was notorious for having speaking way too quietly. Again, Saturn inhibiting, holding back the mercurial voice. So he spoke quietly, he mumbled. His lectures weren't very interesting because he's often just like up at the board mumbling to himself, which it seems so shocking when we compare it to how his writing reads and how epic and magnificent it is. But that's part of the Mercury Saturn. And he was enthusiastic about his subject, though, and he could inspire love of philology in his students. And there is this one story that is told in one of his biographies that he was enthusiastically, I think he was declaiming an Anglo-Saxon, and this was near the end of his life, and his dentures flew out of his mouth. And if we think of dentures as teeth, teeth as a symbol of Saturn, the bones as a symbol of Saturn, old age as a symbol of Saturn, that he's speaking and gesturing in this mercurial way. He's lecturing Mercury, and his mouth too, the mouth being where the voice comes out of, but the teeth that they fly out in that way. So there's the archetypal multivalence of just this Mercury Saturn. You can see in everything from his unfinished projects to his meticulous rewriting of his works, his careful, what he called niggling with language, niggling with his invented languages, and then, the teeth flying out of his mouth. We can see this too, this slowness in The Lord of the Rings itself with the Ents. Don't be hasty. The Ents, like Treebeard, those walking, talking trees. And there's always that admonition, don't hurry, don't be hasty. So there's two other aspects I want to point out in his natal chart. And of course, we're not going to get to the whole natal chart, but I want to be able to share some about his transits as well. But the two aspects I briefly want to look at are his Mars-Jupiter trine. So you can see Mars there at 16 degrees Scorpio, and it's in a trine to Jupiter, 13 degrees Pisces. And the sun is actually at the midpoint between those two, making what I've started referring to as a humble trine, or a petite trine. So instead of a grand trine where it's on the other side, it's two sextiles and a trine. So the sun is at the midpoint of that Mars-Jupiter trine. And Mars and Jupiter, Mars is the warrior and Jupiter is the king. And if we think of one of the great characters in The Lord of the Rings, you have Aragorn, who is the warrior king, and the benevolent warrior, the celebrated warrior. There's so many celebrated warriors throughout The Lord of the Rings. And while the battle scenes do carry that that energy of the Saturn Pluto that Tolkien is also born with, it also carries this quality of the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, the celebrated royal warrior. And another way that this came through actually in Tolkien's life, he was a rugby player, and in his younger years, and he had this kind of athletic, competitive drive that we can see correlated with the Mars Jupiter that he's born with on his sun. But this very kind of jovial, celebratory expression of it, and celebration of the Martian warrior in this way and in his stories. Now there's one other aspect that I want to look at here, and this is a minor aspect, and it is with the moon. So again, we have to keep in mind that this is a rectified time for Tolkien's birth chart, but the moon is in a quincunx with Saturn. And the reason I bring this to our attention with the rectified time of 10 p.m., it's an exact quincunx. And this is one of the things that maybe can kind of hint to perhaps the correctness of this time, among other things that I know others have looked at, like Adam has looked at, the sun in the 5th house in Tolkien's chart. But just looking at this Moon-Saturn quincunx, Tolkien lost both of his parents at a young age. His father died when he had just turned 4 years old, and his father died in South Africa. Tolkien had traveled with his mother and his younger brother up to England to visit family when he was 3 years old. It was a long trip by boat, and while they were gone, his father suffered a hemorrhage and died very unexpectedly, very suddenly, just after Tolkien had turned 4 years old, and just after he'd written his father his first ever letter. There too, you can see the kind of interplay between the Mercury Saturn, the letter writing to the father who's just died, and the Moon Saturn, losing his father at such a young age, and then his mother too, when he was 12 years old. Tolkien's mother, she converted to Catholicism, and when Tolkien was 8, and she came from an Anglican family, which was the common Christian religion in England, was Anglicanism. But for whatever reason, she was drawn to risk everything and become a Catholic. And her family completely rejected her for this. They cut off financial support, obviously emotional support, and she soon she got diabetes, and without the support of her family, and really, diabetes then was a much more dire diagnosis, and her health worsened over a couple years, and then when Tolkien was 12 years old, she died, and he saw her as a martyr to her faith. And he was a devout Catholic, I think in large part because of that, because of her commitment to her faith, and that she essentially died sacrificing herself to it, or that's how he saw her, as this martyr. And so his deep commitment to Catholicism, I think, is very much connected to his commitment to his mother and her memory and the tragedy of that loss. So Moon Saturn, we often see correlated, not always, but we often see correlated with those who lose their parents at a young age, or it's the orphan aspect. And that he has this exact quincunx between the moon and Saturn is really fitting for his biography. So I now want to speak first about another diachronic patterning between of a world transit that correlates with Tolkien's work. And this is the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. So when we think of Uranus and Neptune again, it's related to the imagination, to the symbolic, the archetypal, to the wellspring of images, to fairy, to the imaginal realm, all these things. And Uranus brings an awakening to that, a liberation of that, and often correlates with not only the emergence of new forms of spirituality, but also new experimentation in the arts. And often we see, fantasy stories being told under Uranus-Neptune alignments, whether it's Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll being written under a Uranus-Neptune alignment, or all the great films of the 1990s under the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of that decade that have to do with a kind of surreal bending of reality, of stepping into a fantasy realm. So we can definitely see how Uranus-Neptune really correlates with Tolkien's whole imaginal world of Middle-earth, with the fantastical, with the magical, with the enchanted, the awakening, the Uranian awakening to that. And so in the 20th century, there were 3 alignments of Uranus with Neptune. And, these are longer alignments because both Uranus and Neptune move slowly. And so, using a 15 to 20 degree orb for the world transit, there was an opposition between Uranus and Neptune from 1899 to 1918. And that opposition completely encompasses the time that Tolkien was first engaging with the stories of Middle-earth, working with his imagination in a new way for the first time. And I'm going to unpack more what I mean by that in a minute, but I just want to hold in mind that there was this Uranus-Neptune opposition during those years at the beginning of the 20th century. Then the next alignment of Uranus and Neptune was the square of the 1950s. And of course, the 1950s is when The Lord of the Rings was published. So it's very much carrying the mark of that Uranus-Neptune era. And then finally, the conjunction, the last alignment of Uranus and Neptune in the 20th century was from 1985 to 2001. So basically encompassing the decade of the 1990s and a little on either side. And that's when the films of The Lord of the Rings that were directed by Peter Jackson were being filmed. And so even though those films were released in 2001, 2, and 3 under the Saturn-Pluto opposition, and they carry that archetypal quality, the making of the films themselves, and even that overlap in 2001 is the last year Uranus and Neptune were in conjunction with the release of the first film, which I would say The Fellowship of the Ring is probably the most magical, the most enchanted of the 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings. It's the one that has that is related most to the world of the elves, Rivendell, Lothlorien, with kind of the ancient lore of Middle-earth. Even the Shire, in many ways, is this idyllic pastoral landscape. Whereas the second 2 volumes, The Two Towers and The Return of the King, while they're still carrying those themes, is much more involved in the world of human beings and the conflict of battle and the descent into the hell realm of Mordor. So we see this patterning of Uranus and Neptune, these 3 alignments through the 20th century, and how they correlate with these significant moments in Tolkien's telling of the mythology of Middle-earth. But I want to zero in on that first period, the opposition of Uranus and Neptune. And you'll notice I've just now moved into a rather interesting piece of artwork. So the beginning in 1911, Tolkien started making an unusual series of drawings. And this was exactly during the period that he had the enforced separation from Edith. So it was a very challenging period in many ways. Pluto, there was that long square from Pluto to his natal Saturn that Greg mentioned in his comment, and square to Saturn and opposing Tolkien's Mercury. And so beginning in 1911, but really concentrated in these years from 1911 to 1913, Tolkien started making these very unusual drawings, and he called them Ishnesses. And he compiled them in a book called the Book of Ishness. And I just want to share with you what these images look like, because they're sketches in many ways. Some are more kind of fully realized than others, but they're these really profoundly evocative images that Tolkien is making and recording. And there's no explanation with them. He doesn't talk about them in his journals. The letters that we have available don't speak about them. All that we have are the images themselves and the titles that Tolkien gave them. So the one that is here present is called Before, and it's one of the earliest Ishnesses. And each of the Ishnesses has this kind of evocative, weighty title, but no explanation. So I just want to share what some of these look like. There's this one, Before, which depicts an entryway. Your gaze is kind of pulled toward this monolithic doorway where there's this kind of ominous red glow behind the doorway. It's clearly depicting some kind of an entrance or a threshold. It's called Before. And then the one that follows that is called Afterwards. And you can see a figure here coming out a doorway that is the same shape as the previous image, and walking down this passageway with torches. And they both have this kind of ominous feeling. And they really seem to signify the crossing in some way of a threshold. Now, I want to show a few others. There's this one. This is probably my favorite one, called End of the World. And you can see here there's this figure of a man stepping off a cliff. And he's stepping off above an ocean, and you can see the sun is shining on the scene, the moon is bending, below the horizon, there's stars in the ocean itself. And that title, End of the World, is pretty ominous sounding, rather dark and depressing. And yet maybe it's not referring to the end of the world as in the world's demise or the end of this individual's life, but rather that this figure has reached the end of the known world and is now taking this step into the beyond, into something further. Susan just mentioned that it resembles the Fool in the tarot. Yes, exactly. It looks like the Fool stepping off the cliff. This is an archetypal image, and he's stepping outward, and he's clearly not falling. He's stepping into a different world. And what I have surmised from looking at these images from the Book of Ishness is that this time period in Tolkien's life, which in so many ways was a very difficult time period, was also one of opening to the imagination. And so if we remember again that there's this Uranus-Neptune opposition that's in the sky for everybody, this may be Tolkien's personal expression of it. There's a lot more I could say about this image, how this figure stepping off, maybe stepping onto the straight road, the road that goes to the undying lands, which is a theme that's throughout Tolkien's work. This may be the first image of it. But a lot of what we can say about the Book of Ishness and the images in it are really speculative. So, which in so many ways just allows our own imaginations to light up in response to what is here. So I'm going to share a few more of these. This one is called Beyond, and you can see again it's this road going into the distance, into the beyond, and again that little entryway, it almost looks similar, and you can see here those little trees, they almost look like mushrooms, but it's about this journey into the beyond. An image I don't have pictured here because it was only just recently published, which I'm so delighted about, is called The Back of Beyond, and it was painted on the verso of that image I showed before, End of the World. And The Back of Beyond shows a little man who's at an open window, and he's peering out the window, and you don't see anything of what he might be looking at. Everything around the window is blank, but behind him is this distant landscape of a road leading behind him into the mountains. And I almost like to imagine, even though these two images were done about a year and a half apart, Beyond and The Back of Beyond, The Back of Beyond was done first, that maybe they're somehow connected. Again, what happens when we reach the end of the road, when we go to that threshold? Is that little figure peering out into another world? What is this signifying? Again, we can just speculate what's happening for Tolkien during this time. Here's a few others, and I'll go through these a little more quickly. This one's called Eeriness. And you can see a figure that maybe is an early foreshadowing of Gandalf or some wizard. This one, wickedness, which is extraordinarily, I mean, there's Tolkien's Saturn, Trine, Pluto, the creepiness, the wickedness. There's something also that looks kind of like old alchemical images in this, with the patterning on the floor, the eyes watching above the skull, that hand that has 5 fingers but no thumb. This one, thought, which kind of brings to mind like that radiating thought behind the figure. What happens when we close our eyes and we go into thought? Where are we taken in this journey into the imagination? There's this one, which is called under 10-ishness, as in being under 10 years old. Ishness, that word ishness that shows up in the Ishnesses, that was Tolkien's word for something imaginal, something fantastical. It's referring to the symbolic nature of these drawings. Here's one, not pictured here, but paired with under 10-ishness is another one called grown-up-ishness. So you have both the young and the old. This one's called water, wind, and sand. And I've wondered if this one is a representation of Tolkien's great wave vision. And you can see there that little figure at the front who's surrounded by a kind of cloud. Tolkien used that device in other pieces, one that's in The Hobbit, for example, where there's that cloud around Bilbo to signify that he's invisible, wearing the One Ring. In this one, it makes me wonder if that cloud is suggesting that that figure at the front is at another plane of reality, like a dreamer would be, like Tolkien would be in relation to his great wave vision. Now there's this one. Again, there's so much we could say about this image, but he calls it the shores of Faerie. And so here, this is clearly now directly referring to the realm of Faerie. And you can see that the border, that semicircular border, is created by 2 trees, and these are the 2 trees of Valinor. Telperion on the left, where its last flower became the moon, and Laurelin on the right, and its last fruit became the sun. And they have their own sad story of being poisoned and dying, and these final flower and fruit being brought forward that become the celestial lights in our sky. So we can see here the sun and the moon, these great astrological symbols. Tolkien has an origin for them in his stories. Here's another one. You have that Neptune, Pluto, the dragon, the archetypal dragon. This is called Glorund, and it says at the bottom, Glorund sets forth seeking Turin. This one's a little later in the Book of Ishness and is connected to the Silmarillion stories. And here's another one. You can see the quality of his artwork is heightening throughout as well. This again is a later one, the Halls of Manwë. And what I particularly want to draw your attention to is again the sun and the moon, because you can see the sun there on the left, the left side of the image, it's daytime. On the right side, it's night. Notice the crescent of the moon. The crescent of the moon is bending away from the sun. This is not how we see it in our primary world. This is the world of Faerie. This is the world of the imagination, where the sun and the moon can do that, where the moon can bend away from the sun in a way that is astronomically impossible. So the Book of Ishness is opening up for Tolkien at this time. Oh, here's another one, the Tree of Amalien. And actually, just a word on the Tree of Amalien is that Tolkien would draw this again and again as well. And he said that each of the flowers on it symbolized different stories. And the Tree of Amalien is the tree of tales. So this, in some sense, this tree symbolizes a full mythology. I'm going to come back to this in a moment, these poems, because actually, maybe I didn't include this chart here, so maybe I'll just say it. So that Uranus-Neptune alignment, as it's coming in during those years, first Uranus and that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that was in the sky during, at the beginning of the First World War, that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction is right on Tolkien's Venus. So Venus being the archetype of art, poetry, artistic creativity, and of course beauty, the expression of beauty. And he's having this burgeoning creativity coming through artistically, first as these images in the Book of Ishness, and then as poetry, and finally as stories. So to introduce the poetry, I want first to share these two lines that Tolkien came across in 1913. And the lines are from an Anglo-Saxon poem called Christ by the Anglo-Saxon poet Cynewulf. And the lines are, Eala Arundel Engla Bertast, Offer Middengerd Monum Sended. That translates as, Hail Arundel, brightest of angels, above the middle earth sent unto men. So Tolkien read these lines in 1913, and under that Uranus-Neptune alignment. And he is given two words in this. First of all, you can see the word Middle Earth there in this line, and you see the name Arundel. And that name Arundel fascinated Tolkien, and he wanted to know who it was referring to, what it meant. And he couldn't really find anything in any of his researches of who this figure of Arundel was. It seemed to be maybe an angel, maybe a star, but he decided, well, he was going to find out. So he wrote this first poem, and I'm just sharing here the first verse of it, The Voyage of Arundel, the Evening Star. And the lines are, Arundel sprang up from the ocean's cup in the gloom of the mid-world's rim. From the door of night as a ray of light leapt over the twilight brim, and launching his bark like a silver spark from the golden fading sand, down the sunlit breath of day's fiery death he sped from Westerland. So Tolkien shared this poem with his close friend G.B. Smith, and G.B. Smith said, it's wonderful, what's it about? And Tolkien says, I don't know, I'll try to find out. And that was so much of his approach to his stories, was I'll try to find out, not I'll make it up. Greg just asked if we know if Tolkien read Yeats, and I am going to assume yes. He very likely did. He was extremely well read. Few Tolkien scholars have talked about any direct influence, but I'm sure that he did read Yeats. So what is Arundel? This question is maybe especially pertinent to astrologers because Arundel is a figure that got woven into Tolkien's story. It was kind of the core of the story. It runs all the way through, really to it's the heart of the Silmarillion, who Arundel is and what the Silmarils even are. They're these shining gems that capture the light of those two trees, that, you know, the tree of the sun and the moon that I showed you in that image before. The three gems, the Silmarils, capture that light, and they have their own long history, but one of them is bound to the brow of this figure, Arundel. The spelling of his name eventually changes, so it's pronounced a little bit more like Arundel. But that figure, he sails into the sky with this Silmaril, the shining Silmaril on his brow. And that star, that wandering star he becomes, which is first intimated in this poem that Tolkien wrote in September of 1914, is the planet Venus. And it's mentioned throughout the Lord of the Rings. If you've read it or you go back to read it, you hear of the light of Arundel. Arundel it's the light of that star that's captured in Galadriel's mirror that she puts in the phial that she gives to Frodo, that becomes that light for him in the darkness. And it's this important figure. Arundel is actually Elrond's father. So there's this whole kind of lineage as well of who this figure is and how he shows up in all the different stories. But in some ways, Tolkien reading that Anglo-Saxon poem and then writing this poem about Arundel back in 1914, that's the seed of the whole Middle-earth mythology. And I think it's significant that Arundel as a figure, as a planet, a wandering star, is Venus, the Venus of our world, the evening star. And that it happened that Tolkien was getting Jupiter-Uranus at that time on his Venus, this awakening to that creativity and the actual expression in his own creativity of Venus. So this is the chart for when he wrote that poem, The Voyage of Arundel. And you can see there toward the bottom that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction and also the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. I mean, this is right at the time that the First World War is starting. And then if we overlay it with Tolkien's chart, you can see there on the right, there's the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. It's on his Venus. And what you can also see is that Neptune, which is opposite Uranus and has been for many years in the world transits, it's moving in. It's not yet in orb for a personal transit with Tolkien's Venus, but it will be. First, it's moving. Neptune is moving into the square, the 90-degree angle to Tolkien's natal Uranus. So now we have a mirroring between Tolkien's personal transits and the transits in the collective, that he's getting this Uranus-Neptune, this awakening to the imagination, to story at this time. That's those first years of writing, first this poem, The Voyage of Arundel, then the very first stories of Middle-earth, the Fall of Gondolin, the Tale of Beren and Luthien, the Tale of Turambar, as Neptune is moving first in that square to Uranus, and then that opposition to Venus, awakening his artistic creativity, his poetry, his exquisite use of language. Now, I'm going to jump ahead a lot in time now, and look at when the Fellowship of the Ring, or when all of the Lord of the Rings was published. And we could probably do an interesting analysis of when each volume was published in 1954 and 55. I want particularly to look at the world transits for these rather than Tolkien's personal transits, although there are things we can unpack there too. Tolkien spent 12 years writing The Lord of the Rings. As I said before, that's so fitting for his Mercury-Saturn square, how long it took him. And so he was writing that from 1937 until 1949. Then it took another 5-6 years until they were actually brought forward in published form, just because so much editing. It was such a hefty tome. There was a paper shortage because of World War II, still a paper shortage even for the publishers, and it had all the complicated maps and everything. So it was this major undertaking, not only on Tolkien's part, but the publishers. And so it's finally released, the first volume, July 29th, 1954. And there you can see in this chart the tight Uranus-Neptune square that's there. Again, that diachronic patterning with the Uranus-Neptune from the much, much earlier in Tolkien's life when he's writing these first stories and poems of Middle-earth. Now his magnum opus is being published, and it's under the very next alignment of those two. There's that Uranus square to Neptune. If we move forward to the two towers, you can see the Uranus-Neptune there again, and there's also by then the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of 54 and 55 was really tight, and so the Lord of the Rings itself, it's not only an expression of Saturn square Pluto, of Uranus square Neptune, but also of that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. Again, there's this mirroring of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction on Tolkien's Venus when he's writing The Voyage of Arundel and he's first stepping across the threshold into Middle-earth. And again, when the story is being published, which was really a major artistic breakthrough of its time. As I was saying, nothing like this had been done before. When C.S. Lewis wrote a review of The Lord of the Rings, he said, he said just that, nothing like this has been done before. This is like lightning from a clear sky. We can hear the Uranian quality of lightning coming through in C.S. Lewis's praise of the Lord of the Rings, that Jupiter Uranus. This is lightning from a clear sky. And then finally, the Two Towers, or sorry, the Return of the King comes out almost a year later, after the Two Towers, 11 months later. Can you imagine being alive in the mid-50s and you get your hands on, for those of us who love this story, you get your hands on the Fellowship of the Ring and then Return of the King and then the Two Towers, and you're waiting for the Return of the King for almost a year. Yeah, I mean, we're so lucky now that we just get to jump from one page to the next. But you can see here, a year later with the publication of Return of the King, again, the Uranus-Neptune square is still there. It's a little wider. The Jupiter-Uranus has passed, but there's now a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. And so this is interesting that the Return of the King happened to be published, even though it was done being written many years before, it's published under Jupiter-Pluto. And Tolkien is born, let me go back to Tolkien's chart. Oh, I'm gonna have to go back all the way through that artwork. Okay, I'll just describe it. You can see it here in the middle. So Tolkien is born with Jupiter in a wide square to Pluto and Neptune. And you can see both of those, the Jupiter-Pluto, the magnitude of what he took on with this story, the ambition of it. That's a Jupiter-Pluto theme. And so the Return of the King is published under a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, again, mirroring Tolkien's natal Jupiter-Pluto square. And these themes of the heights and the depths, the kingly and the demonic, the corrupt and the celebrated. And then you can also see the Jupiter-Neptune square that Tolkien's born with as well. The vastness of his imagination, the expansiveness of that world. Greg mentioned earlier in his comments that Neptune is now stationing for the first time on Tolkien's Jupiter, which is true. And so I feel so delighted to be getting to teach more on Tolkien's work at this time when Neptune is crossing his Jupiter. And I feel like interest in Tolkien's work, in the same way that it was really in the collective in 2001, 2, and 3 when the films came out, I feel that coming forward again in a new way with Amazon taking on making a 5-season series based on Tolkien's writings, filling out parts of the story that haven't yet been made into film. I hope they do it justice. I really do. So something feels significant about that transit, that Neptune is crossing Tolkien's natal Jupiter. So just to bring this discussion to a conclusion before we open this to dialogue, questions, comments, in our last 15 or however many more minutes we have together, I just want to speak to the role of the cosmos in Tolkien's cosmology, because I've actually, as someone who does discuss these things sometimes more publicly, whether on podcasts or just YouTube videos, I've gotten some pushback from some people I think it's the general pushback that all of us astrologers get around using astrology in general, that this is such a tool that a practice, an art that inspires such skepticism and at times vitriolic rejection. But I have gotten some pushback from people saying, well, why are you bringing astrology into dialogue with Tolkien? Tolkien was a Catholic. He wouldn't have liked this. He would have been very much averse to doing that. And I think that's actually in some ways a profound misunderstanding of Tolkien and who he was, because his Catholicism didn't exclude him being able to write a cosmogony, a creation myth that allowed for both one creator god and a pantheon of gods, like we see in the pagan mythologies. Didn't stop him from doing that. It didn't even stop him from writing themes such as reincarnation into his story. Elves, they're immortal, but they can physically die and then be reborn through their children. So he's, yes, maybe that's somewhat heretical for the Catholicism that Tolkien was committed to, but I feel there is most definitely not only room for the astrological worldview in his cosmos, but an embrace of that. And you can see it in, for example, Varda, who is one of the Valar, one of the powers of the world. She's like the queen of heaven in some ways. She's called Elbereth Gilthoniel. That means star queen, star kindler. And she's the most beloved of the Valar to the elves because she created the stars. She shaped the stars out of light. And there, in any good myth, we learn how the cosmos is made, where the sun is from, where the moon is from, who made the stars. And Tolkien is speaking to all of that, as we can, so what at the core of his myth is this image of the two trees of Valinor, the silver and the golden tree that wax and wane with their light. It's their light and the Silmarils that sets in motion the whole of the Silmarillion. If you've wondered what the Silmarillion means, it translates as of the Silmarils. So the solar and lunar are so present. I also think it's really interesting that in Tolkien's mythology, the sun is female and the moon is male. Anar, the sun, is female. Isil, the moon, is male, which we see in the German language, Die Sonne and der Mond. We see that in Japanese mythology. So even though there's often been a correlation between the feminine and the lunar and the masculine and the solar, we can see there are different expressions. As Deidre is commenting right now, the birth of the sun and moon from flower and fruit in his drawing easily show validity of astrological connection. Also, the Erendel is male, as Venus. The planet Mars is called Carnil, one of the planets, the wandering stars made by Varda. Carnil translates in Elvish as red star. Jupiter is called Morwen. So he's paying close attention to the cosmology, and even within the story itself, there are figures in the ancient history of Middle-earth who watched the stars, particularly the people of Gondor, who are descended from the Númenóreans, that island, that Atlantis-like island that sank. They watched the stars, they tracked the stars. And so I feel like this is a very fitting way to approach Tolkien's work, not only because it's illuminating just to look at his birth chart or at his transits or the world transits, but within the story itself and the celebration of the stars, of the celestial, that is present in his work. So that's my tale of Tolkien and astrology. There's so much more that we could discuss, and I would love to open it up to dialogue, and it looks like that's already coming in. So I'm going to just start interfacing with those and reading them. And Adam, also, if you want to jump in at any point, or if you have thoughts or questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
I'm just speculating about which characters are which sun signs.
Well, I'm not going to do it right now because that would have me diving through the the Tale of Years, which is Appendix B in The Lord of the Rings, but you get most of the birth dates for most of the characters. We don't get the years, obviously, because it's a totally different year system, but if you're just looking at sun signs, you can do it. Aragorn is born on March 1st. Frodo and Bilbo are both born at the fall equinox on September 22nd. You can do it for a lot of them. So if that's an area that anyone wants to go into, it's a pretty fascinating thing to explore.
That is awesome.
All right, so I saw a question from Betty. Have you examined the ecological theme in the series? I'm going to just say yes. Parallel to that of C.S. Lewis's work in its depiction of the destruction of forests and the threat to the agrarian ideal of the Shire, to find an astrological representation. Oh, I see. Yes. This was in reference to the way the English countryside was being despoiled by the Industrial Revolution beginning in the 19th century through the mechanized warfare of the two world wars. This was actually how I was first wanting to work with Tolkien's narrative in, I recently finished my PhD on Tolkien's Red Book and the Red Book of Carl Jung, and that ended up being the path I followed. But when I first started my PhD, I wanted to look at the relationship between basically Tolkien's ecological imagination and how stories such as The Lord of the Rings can, in some sense, awaken our ecological imagination. And I've spoken about this in terms of our relationship to fairy, our relationship to the imaginal realm. I personally feel most like I'm wandering through Middle Earth when I am out in the natural world, and I can just recognize the enchantment of, the sunlight coming in at twilight, or the rustling of the wind in the trees, or, getting to look up and see the stars, see the heavens. That is when I feel most close to fairy, most close to the imaginal realm. And I suspect that's the case for many people. There's this rich ecological theme that's present in Tolkien's work, and it's definitely something that has been explored by other Tolkien scholars, but I think always can be. Is there an astrological connection to the ecological? Let me make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. So the question is around, is there an astrological connection to the destruction of the landscape? I mean, in some ways, we can see a correlation here with the Saturn-Pluto. Pluto relating to nature, the elemental powers of nature, and Saturn both having to do with the harm to that, Pluto also relating to destruction. So that kind of co-creative theme between the two of the destruction of nature, the protection of nature. And we see correlations through history of a kind of preservation of nature, whether it's during world transits or people such as Teddy Roosevelt or Thomas Berry, born with Saturn Pluto, who step up to preserve the natural world, to fight on its behalf. So there is that correlation there. Deidre brought up that they noticed in Tolkien's drawings there's a dragon-like image in several, and that reminds them of Jung's drawings, the serpent present. Yes, Tolkien and Jung were both painting and drawing dragons over and over again, and this is a lot of what my dissertation work ended up looking at, is all these parallel images between Jung's Red Book, his paintings, his drawings of dragons, of trees, of and Tolkien's in the Book of Ishness and in his stories. There are so many parallel themes between the two that's why I ended up dedicating my whole dissertation research to finding those parallels. Greg brought up also in response to Betty's question, surely the astrological is part of the ecological. And I want to check out that Yeats's poem, The Two Trees. I'm not familiar with it personally, and definitely want to explore that. I wonder what year that came out, because Tolkien did that drawing of the two trees and wrote his first poem about the two trees in 1915. It's one of his juvenilia. Interesting. Well, I look forward to looking into Yeats's poem. So I'm now just tracking through the comments to make sure I haven't missed anything. Are there any other thoughts or questions? Or Greg brought up the same people who push back against astrological themes with Tolkien probably don't see the same thing in the Bible. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the astrological, the archetypal is in all of our myths, whether we call them fiction or whether we call them religious truth, they're there. We see the astrological informing every religious and spiritual revelation. That's its own theme, of course, but yeah, so it's saturating the biblical and the mythic at every level. Betty's wondering about a specific indicator in the charts, and again with that ecological theme, I would speak to, again, that Saturn Pluto trine that Tolkien is born with, and even the grand trine with Neptune. Oh, I see. Okay, that was a response to Greg. Well, I'll just finish that thought, which can be the Venus Saturn Pluto can be a deep love and desire to protect nature, to protect the natural world. That there are these kind of major ecological themes associated with it. Adam brought up that he was just reading a Purana, and the story includes characters whose basic identities are related to planetary archetypes. I mean, speaking of correlations with stories connected to Tolkien and planets, I'm thinking of C.S. Lewis, who was Tolkien's closest friend, and the Narnia stories, those 7 stories, and how Michael Ward, in his dissertation and then his book Planet Narnia, noticed that those 7 books seem each to be dedicated to the 7 ancient planets. Yeah, Planet Narnia is an amazing book. Something that I realized in reading it is that not only do each of the 7 stories in the Narnia Chronicles of Narnia correlate with the 7 planets, but the particular expressions of the planets in each of those books reflects C.S. Lewis's natal positions, his natal aspects. So it's an amazing multi-layered exploration. Adam brought up that Lewis was far more of an evangelist than Tolkien, although it was because of Tolkien that Lewis became a Christian. When Lewis had his conversion experience that was shaped and influenced by Tolkien, obviously that conversion can only happen within oneself ultimately, but Lewis talks about coming to his knees in prayer, the most reluctant convert in all, I can't remember if it's in all of England or all of Christendom. But yeah, that Lewis definitely wasn't afraid to go into astrology, although of course he isn't explicit in any of the writing we've seen that the 7 Chronicles of Narnia are meant to correlate with the 7 planets, but I do think Michael Ward is onto something. And I don't think Tolkien would have been afraid to go into the astrological. Indeed, he wasn't. So that's, I think they very much have a right to be together. The world of Middle Earth and our understanding of the astrological in its many forms. Are there any other thoughts or comments or questions or objections. I know we're right at the 2-hour point, so I'm happy to wrap it up. If there's anything that's coming, not coming forward, it's been an absolute delight getting to share this with all of you. Adam brought up a question about Saturn, Pluto. The question is, how is that combination seen in Middle Earth? What do I think of it, of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, if at all? In terms of the current Saturn-Pluto conjunction, is that what you mean? The current one. Well, I think the way I can best speak to that is that the moral drama that plays out in The Lord of the Rings, in Tolkien's stories, not only The Lord of the Rings, but all of them, of this, not only a conflict between good and evil, but a facing of that shadow within oneself. And that these are really important lessons for our time and for the current Saturn-Pluto conjunction that is going to be exact next year and the following, that we really can take some powerful lessons from this story of, I think of that line of what Gandalf says to Frodo when Frodo says that he wished that this hadn't happened in his time, that he hadn't received the ring, that Sauron hadn't come back to power during this time, and he's feeling the heaviness, the weightiness of the world and the task before him. Such Saturn-Pluto themes. And Gandalf says to him, it's my favorite line in the entire book, that so do all who come to see such times, and that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And if we can keep that in mind during our current Saturn-Pluto era, and know that humanity, the Earth, has been through such dark times before, and that this too shall come to an end in whatever form. And I'm not just speaking to, I don't want to just speak to the heaviness or the shadow side of Saturn-Pluto, but the reality is the world does feel darker and heavier and in conflict right now. And whatever we can do to draw strength, to build our moral fortitude, because that is the gift of Saturn-Pluto, that moral grounding, that capacity to recognize and work with and integrate the shadow in ourselves. Something I've been saying a lot recently is this wonderful quote from C.G. Jung, and Jung was born with Saturn square Pluto too. He says, know that the line of good and evil runs through your own heart. And I feel like that's so important for us to remember. We can think of a figure like Gollum, we can think of a figure like Frodo, and those different ways to approach that line. That line can split us. We can project the evil out there, or we can own it within ourselves. We can wrestle within it within ourselves, and we can take on the tasks that are asked of us in this time. And what I love about this story that Tolkien wrote is that he speaks to the power that the most humble, the smallest amongst us have to be able to affect change. Indeed, it's only the smallest who can do that in some ways. So that's really the call of this story, of this myth. And that if we can remember that, what that story is telling us, that this really is in some ways a myth for our time, a myth even for these few years going through the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, then we'll have a wonderful guide by our side. So maybe that's a perfect note to end this conversation on. Yeah, it's been such a joy getting to speak with you all, and also to see all your comments and thoughts coming in.
Yay. Thank you, Becca. That was so wonderful. And yeah, I just kept thinking about the Saturn Pluto transit coming up and thinking about Middle Earth, and
Mm,
I felt like if I kicked that question to you, you'd have something really profound to say. And boy, did you. Thank you.
thank
That
you.
was, that was awesome.
Oh, my pleasure.
Um,
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really, I love getting to talk about these things, as you can tell.
well, we love listening and sitting under the learning tree together. This has been awesome. Um, I want to direct everybody to Becca's website, which I will put into the chat box right now. That is beccatarnas.com. You can check out Becca's work there, and classes are listed there if you want to get into some Middle Earth classes with you, Becca.
Yeah, I'm currently teaching one right now on the Lord of the Rings, so I'm super steeped in this. But I'm going to be offering one in the spring on the Silmarillion, so that's a little more in depth and geared toward the deep Tolkien devotee. And then I'm going to be offering the same course on the Lord of the Rings, which is designed both for people who've read it before and also who've never encountered Tolkien's work. I'm going to be offering that again next fall. Since it had such a positive response this fall.
Very cool. That sounds awesome. Deidre's asking, is your dissertation published somewhere, available?
My dissertation is, I'm currently in the process of trying to bring it out as a book, so hopefully it will be published in that form. But I'm currently sharing it privately with people who write me, because the only way to access it right now is if you're a university library, and most people aren't university libraries. So if you send me an email, and you can contact me through my website that Adam put up, then I'm happy to privately share a copy, a PDF of my dissertation with you.
Very cool. That's awesome. And you had mentioned that there is an Amazon series coming out. I had no idea. Is there a release date for that we can all look forward to?
I think it's still several years down the line, and they're figuring out exactly how they're doing it. But Amazon recently got the rights. They're not remaking The Lord of the Rings itself. They're doing it to be compatible with the films that came out in 2001 to 3. It looks like the first story they're probably going to be telling is that of the younger Aragorn. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, it's like, oh, this is really exciting. On the other hand, I just really hope that they do it justice. There's a part of me that secretly wishes I could be on their consultation team.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not sure exactly. It's several years down the line still, but they're planning on 5 seasons.
So it's not going to be a retelling of the actual Lord of the Rings books at all.
It won't be. It's going into the other material that Tolkien wrote, and obviously there's a huge amount of that. So
Wow. Yeah, that should be really fascinating. So thank you again for just all of the depth of knowledge. I mean, I just when you said that when you were young and the place felt familiar to you, I was like, that's it.
yeah,
I know what you were saying. I was like, that's how it felt to me too.
yeah.
So that was really cool. That'll stay with me because I haven't heard it described like that before, and it just put words to an experience I've had. So thank you
Mm,
for that. Um,
yeah.
well, speaking of people who put amazing words and images together to illuminate astrology, next week Sean Nygaard will be with us on Tuesday night giving a talk on Jupiter entering Sagittarius. His talks are also, like Becca's, just rich, imaginative, awesome archetypal explorations. Sean's one of my favorite people. He is like a aficionado of James Hillman. We geek out about
Mhm.
James Hillman together. For a couple of years, actually, we met pretty regularly to just sit and talk about Hillman's books together online. So Sean's really cool, and that should be a fun talk next week. So I hope to see you all there. One last reminder, if you haven't already, I've gotten good amount of donations came in during the talk, so thank you all for that. But if you haven't yet, please do click on the donate button. There's the link in the website, and donate so that we can support Becca and her amazing work. If for some reason you checked out of this talk and popped back in, and sometimes people miss portions or whatever, if you attended and made a donation, I am happy to send you the audio video recording, but you have to email me at nightlightastrology@gmail.com, and I will send it to you. I don't make it for sale after the fact, so that's only goes out for people who were actually here tonight or who donated prior to tonight. So Becca, we're going to have to, the next part that Becca and I talked about doing, which we'll have to confirm for sure, but the next part we talked about was doing something, was the next piece going to be on Carl Jung?
I would love to do that, particularly focusing on his Red Book, which his Red Book was the exact same years he was working on that, those exact same years that Tolkien was doing the Book of Ishness and writing those first stories of Middle-earth. So that same Uranus-Neptune opposition. So it's a lot of the same transits, but hitting a totally different chart. And yeah, I would love to explore that next.
Yeah, and so we were talking about a trilogy of Tolkien, Jung, and then Tolkien and Jung together, and just putting them in a rap battle at the end.
Actually, they're not competing with each other. They really.
Oh no, they aren't. I want them to. I think that would. I'm just kidding. Okay, cool. Well, thank you again, Becca, and thanks everyone for being here, and we will see you guys all next week. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Adam. Good night.